Thank you. Christine, thank you very much for the great introduction. Well, thank you for the CV Society Switzerland and Corestone to be here. I think it's great. My name is Alfred. As it happens, I'm also a board member of the CV Society in Netherlands, and we, a couple of years ago, merged both societies, where we had a Dutch one and the CV Society there. And I think the fun part is in positioning our new society, we decided which role models there were in the world, and Switzerland is one of them. So it's great to be here in actually my role model, so I'm very excited. Thank you very much, very, very much. Two speakers. I'm the academic one, so I'm the one who's probably going to mumble difficult words. He's going to be the man with practice, experience, and very clear vision. So bear with me. I'm going to start with, I would say, well, the roots, if you will, the basics, and then Jaap will take on from that. Jaap and I know each other from, I think, well, way back, different routes, all both in asset management. At some point I moved towards academia, but we always kept in touch with a very, I think, basic and simple conversation, and it all has to do, how can we help trustees basically to earn better returns, of course, given the risk, etc., for better pensions? I think that's the key question which we all have to center on, and which is the key question which investment beliefs deal with. Sounds philosophical, but it's about real Swiss francs, euros, dollars, which have to be earned for our pensioners. So Jaap will go through, well, what we call the transformation process, if you will. So as a case of a large pension fund, Dutch pension funds, where the board basically decided to reinvent itself after the great financial crisis. And what does it need to be a successful pension fund or long-term investor, and how is it relevant for its members? And as Jaap's discussion will show, an important tool that Jaap employed in this whole transformation process were stating and formulating beliefs. And that's where my presentation as a starter will focus on. So I'd like to take you through the framework which you developed through the book. So what are they? How can we identify those beliefs? How do they work? And how do they play a valuable role for trustees? And once we've done this discussion, we're also going to look at, well, how should we use them in a daily practice, and also what sort of mistakes should we avoid with beliefs. The term ideological was already mentioned by Christine, and that's one of the things to avoid, and I'm going to give you a heads up on how to do so. So that's basically the agenda which I'd like to follow. Perhaps a few words before I delve into the investment beliefs, because I think it helps thinking about why we will pick out this topic. One of the, well, questions or puzzles we have, perhaps puzzle is the better word here. All smart people in the room? Is this a point where you all nod yes? Thank you. And we have, most of us come on some sort of investment course, either through university, CFA, and we learned how an investment process works, the sort of steps which it takes. And you can sort of imagine that if there's some sort of efficiency in the markets, and there's a lot of arbitrage, a lot of knowledge which is shared, that if we correct for asset allocation, investment styles, etc., that on average, similar returns should be visible. That's, I think, was sort of the starting point for the discussion which Jaap and I had, because this is not the case. So if we correct for also, we see disparity in returns. This is not new, by the way. So from the 1990s onwards, investment authors like Keith Ammer's here, very famous, pointed on what he called the governance gap. Wait a minute, just based on the inventory, but also an assessment by investors, trustees, there's a huge differential. Those studies were later, different authors repeated. There is no encompassing total study, but if you sort of put the puzzles together, it's not surprising to find at least a performance differential of 50 basis points, at least. If you talk to Anglo-Saxons, we Dutch are a bit, well, Calvinistic, if you will, a bit conservative. The Anglo-Saxon would say, well, it's far more. But let's say 50 basis points, for argument's sake, if that's really the case. And then over a period of 20 years, do the math, interest and interest, we were talking about real money in the long term. And it's not about being the smartest investor in the room, it's also about being smart about avoiding specific net worth choices. So I think there's a lot to be learned and earned, if you will, in this discussion. And Jaap and I looked at this performance differential and tried to basically look at investment process. Where did it all start? So we sort of at some point skipped the investment managers, all doing the hard work, all in control, fiduciary management, and we came to the point. Wait a minute, the board. Some specific choices which the board makes are perhaps far more essential and instrumental than we figure. And that is, I think, the basis for the book. So how can we help trustees to add value, but also to avoid specific mistakes? Now, within this, I would say one of our other findings is somewhere hidden in the book. No, that's not true. An important finding is that we find that well-run boards, the trustees, focus on creating what we'd like to call balance. So on the one hand, balance between design and strategy, and on the other hand, on implementation. And in discussions, we sort of developed, I would say, two connected loops, if you will. So the left loop is a slow-moving process of design and strategy. Long-term, we're long-term investors as pension funds. And the right loop would be the fast-moving implementation loop. So whenever we read something in the newspaper, it's probably something which takes place in the right loop. And that's typically what we see. So the right loop gets a lot of attention in practice, but the left loop, if we distinguish between the good and the bad run boards, the left loop matters far more for the long-term outcomes. And once again, creating balance between those loops is what well-run boards do. So I'm not going to go into those key activities, but when we talk about investment beliefs, we're talking about designing the process, making the important choices, the key concepts, basically designing, if you will, the investment model. What sort of vision do we have for financial markets, and how does it translate to a workable investment model which can then be implemented? So it touches upon a lot of themes within the investment process. Okay, I promised academic part, here it is. Perhaps before we delve into the theory, if I might share a personal story, because investment beliefs for me were, I was able to work with Jaap together for a long time. And there was a moment in time when it really triggered my thinking. So I started out as a portfolio manager somewhere in the late 1990s, whatever you did, all markets went up, so it was a great time to basically pay off your mortgage. And somehow in this whole process, I got interested in the question, wait a minute, if we look at those returns, if we look at the decomposition of return, what adds value and not? So from somewhere in the early 2000s, I started also inspired with discussions with Jaap, thinking about investment beliefs, so writing all sorts of articles and stuff. This gained some attention, and I was invited into serving at an investment committee, which was great and boosted sort of my ego. So I got a letter actually confirming the appointment. Glad I was just about updating my LinkedIn account. Wait a minute, 2008. Yes, LinkedIn existed in 2008. But I got a telephone call from my chair, the chair of the new investment committee where I was sitting on. The first meeting I was to have was to be a crisis meeting. I forgot to mention a very small detail. We talk about October 2008. So the worst ever possible time to be appointed, let alone have your first meeting. But there it was. Somewhere late in the evening, the crisis meeting started, and the chair of the investment committee summarized the deplorable situation of the fund, of course. Of course, equities have dropped, interest rates have gone down, cover ratio decreased sharply, uncertainty all around, etc., etc. What to do? And then came the remark. The chair said, well, thankfully, we now have an expert on board. All eyes on me, and I was sweating. I was really, really, really sweating. Oh my God, what have I done? How am I ever going to get out of this room in one piece? So I started asking questions just to figure out a way out of the misery. And simple questions. So I question about the asset allocation. Why do you have this specific asset allocation? Okay, so you have a static asset allocation, 50-50. Okay. What is the main assumption between the static behind the static asset allocation? Okay, wait a minute. So in terms of risk premiums, when equities go down, you are going to go rebalancing. Okay, and why is this the case? Well, you'd like to profit from the mean reversion effect. Okay, so wait a minute. So in a situation where we're now, rebalancing would make sense, because this is the moment in time where you actually earn money by doing this. It's exciting, but okay. Second question, is this time different? There we had to Google and look up. Okay. The crisis probably not at its deepest point. It was to be, I think, 4 months later or 5 months later. But as it stood right now, in 1929 over prolonged periods, 1987 also a big shock. Okay, so this time was also not different. So our assumption basically hadn't changed. So combining 1 and 1 should equal 2, which, okay, given the fact that you've made the strategy, you've chosen the strategy with these assumptions, and these assumptions are valid, you should continue and rebalance the portfolio. In other words, sell 30% of bonds and buy equities at the worst possible time. I was asked to leave the room for the simple reason, should we revoke his appointment? It does make sense whatsoever. And the board eventually decided, well, not 30%, we were going to buy half of it, and not even that. So in the end, they de-risked. That was to be the worst possible time. I had no vision whatsoever. The markets rebounded far later than I expected, but it learned me one thing. All investment choices have assumptions, every one of them. There's not an objective, rational one. They all have assumptions. The problem is, or the opportunity is, those assumptions will be tested at the worst possible times. And good boards think through them beforehand, not at the time when they're tested. And the way to do, of course, is a bit of tunnel vision argumentation, is of course by formulating those beliefs. So let's have in the few minutes left, let's take a look at what are the specific beliefs, the linkage to the implementation, when do we change them and what to avoid. And I think that those elements provide great elements, ingredients for the discussion of the case which Jaap is going to present. Okay, when we talk about investment beliefs, it's quite simple. It's something like this. You always need to have a picture process in place, but the purpose of investment beliefs is quite simple. You formulate a belief about important choices in the investment process, that's one. You agree on the theory of the assumptions that support the belief, and then you decide on implementation. And finally, you figure out what is needed to make it a success. That's the organization part. So 4 elements. So when you think about first one, formulate a belief. You do it on a daily basis. Every investment plan has a number of those beliefs. For example, how does your pension fund consider diversification? Is diversification extreme shock, unexpected shocks? Are we talking about diversification of economic factors, cash flows? just looking in the literature, there are at least 5 to 7 different definitions and also consequences of the term diversification. So you have to have a specific view and choose one of them and figure out what it means and what sort of arguments you have to choose this one. For example, we know that diversification is very helpful when markets go up, but the part of diversification doesn't work when markets go down. Okay, wait a minute. If this is important, then is diversification really free lunch? Basic questions where you as a board think, okay, how do we as a board view diversification? The second step, of course, I mentioned it, you think about the theory and the fundamentals behind this belief. So I can talk about diversification, but what sort of research do we have? Can I find investment consultants which can tell me, well, it's all nice that you think that diversification is free lunch, but look at all this evidence, sort of makes sense or doesn't make sense. In other words, it gives you a sort of feeling, the level of evidence on whether it works or not. Other way around, if you see a mechanism in the markets which works, but you cannot find in the theory, there's also probably a good reason to avoid this. Third, there has to be an investment strategy in place. And this is the part where the investment manager gets excited. It makes sense. You have, from the left look perspective, thought about the main choices within the investment process, thought about the argumentation, and now you move to, and what does this mean for implementation? It isn't detailed into the final lines, but as an investment manager, fiduciary manager, you should get a feeling, oh, wait a minute, given the disbelief and assumption, I know now how the implementation sort of works. And fourth, mentioned earlier, organization. I can have a great idea as a board. I think alpha pays off, which can be great. I have a theory why it works. I even have investment strategy in place, but if I have not thought through what this means for my organization, what do I need in terms of manager selection or specific other requirements to make it a success, then I have a problem as well. So 4 elements which are in place. And from a board perspective, this is great. You have to spend a couple of days thinking really hard on those investment beliefs, making sure they make sense and it's consistent, and they form basically the basis for self-discipline. Not every discussion which comes up is relevant. You relate them to, wait a minute, we thought about them before, we have made a belief about diversification, let's stick to this until new or better evidence comes along. Okay. Let's make it a bit more concrete. And when we talk about this, investment beliefs, they're quite philosophical. But we also found in our discussions and interviews with boards that I would say the 80-20 rule. That a lot of boards sort of have the same similar concerns of questions. So they share a lot of topics. And that's we decided roughly 8 topics which matter a lot. Well, and we first had a discussion with boards. Well, you should consider costs. You should consider something like risk premiums. And I said, well, this is far too vague. I'm an academic, so I said it made sense from my perspective. So I said, but give us something to help the discussion. So I say, okay, this is roughly what we see currently in the market as, I would say, belief which relates to those 8 topics. And there lies a danger, because one of the most important things is there should be your beliefs as a fund. So take the topic, think what you think beforehand, make your changes and adopt them in any way, but tackle the topics because they form the most important decisions which you have to make as a board. So we'd like to call them a starter kit. In the sense, start a discussion, the outcome might be totally different, but you have a point where you can start. Talking about point of start, When you think about linking the beliefs to the implementation, if you have 4 different steps, we find that well-run boards think about all the 4 steps, think about whether they're consistent, but if you look where they spend the most time on, is about our expertise as a board is managing the whole pension fund, and we should be have the basis for some very important key decisions. So our focus should be on the investment beliefs and the theory. Then we have a discussion with our investment manager, fiduciary consultant, okay, and how will this consistently translate into strategy and what is needed for the organization? But from a strategic perspective, the focus for the board will be on the first part. The value added for the investment manager, executive office, or investment manager will be in the translation and thinking through the consequences to make it a success. So here you see it's not just a dictate, if you will, from the board. It's also a starting point for, I think, a very constructive discussion with the ones who are actually implementing the investments. Okay, you're still excited about implementing beliefs? I see at least 2 nods. That's good. When Jaap has finished, it will probably increase all the way to 20 or 30. So we're on our way, Jaap. That's good news. Okay. There's one other problem if you write down your beliefs. At some point, the board ratifies them. They're written down all kinds of plans, and they sort of become static. And this feels uneasy. Wait a minute. We spent all this time, but we see those markets changing. Wait a minute. We now have negative interest rates, and the whole set of beliefs were based on positive interest rates. Shouldn't we change them? And that's a very good question, and one which you should absolutely tackle, but tackle in the right way. And here comes another disclaimer. I'm an academic, but I also am a trustee, a professional trustee at the pension fund for the general practitioners in the Netherlands. Great to be there. But doctors have a very specific way of viewing research and evidence. And the way they look at it, whenever I consult or visit someone, and for example, he or she has a runny nose, then I just look up, Google, wait a minute, how many research do we have about runny noses? Wait a minute, already thousands of research studies have been published about how to treat runny noses. Probably the 1,001st study will not really change the protocol on how to treat runny noses. Wouldn't you agree? So, in other words, the higher the level of research is, the higher the level of evidence, the more strongly the recommendation will be to pursue this specific strategy. Now, just for theoretical purposes, and the other way around, it's about impact investing is an important subject. How many papers do you know about impact investing? A lot compared to active passive, for example, diversification, or just the opposite? Few. We just had a starting point of figuring out what it means, how it works. And but the problem is if you have a few papers, for example, 3 important papers or 3 important investigations, the 4th one might well turn around the view on how to deal with the specific belief about impact investing. Okay, so here we have something to learn from our from general practitioners, and the idea is quite simple. You scale your investment beliefs. And as a rule of thumb, which can definitely help the board, also if you as a consultant or advisor help your board, the higher of the quality, the more evidence underpinning the investment belief, the more stronger the recommendations should be, but also the higher the hurdle should be to change the specific investment belief. Other way around, if there's not that much evidence to be found, you should be prepared, whenever new information comes around, to revisit and review. And also, you shouldn't be afraid to change your specific investment beliefs. So typically what you find is investment beliefs about costs, active, passive, diversification tend to have a high level of recommendation consequences because there's a lot of information around. For example, the topic which you mentioned about ESG, or well, even topics like factor investing every now have a relatively lower level of evidence. So based on that, you get a far better discussion, because every now and then you ask your staff, your consultant, your advisor, your fiduciary manager, wait a minute, I'm not going to change my investment belief because the results are disappointing, but please tell me, has the evidence changed? Is there new compelling evidence to change my view? So, with thanks to the doctors. Finally, Jaap, now I'm really moving to final. Do I have still? Great, thank you. Such an exciting topic, really is. No, but I think the topic really adds value, I think, for trustees in decision making and long returns. The sales pitch I just gave about investment beliefs only goes so far. And I already mentioned it a bit. There are limits to how it works. For example, the discussion we just had about when to change them. But there are also some pitfalls to avoid. They are easily observable. And I think an important pitfall is when you start this process, you'd like to make your own investment beliefs, would be, let's copy one of the great leaders in our sector. Sounds like something which you shouldn't do, but yeah, it happens. And just to give you an example, of which I think you're all very much aware of, Yale Endowment Fund, for example, had a tremendous success in terms of liquid assets or long-term strategies, sourcing all new kinds of assets. So a great model to follow, which a lot of endowment funds, but also larger pension funds did. However, and I think it was Josh Lerner from the Harvard Business School did some closer reading and said, well, wait a minute, those beliefs, the way they were translated into strategy, the organization was so unique, so specific for Yale, it was almost impossible for other funds to copy in terms of network, first mover advantage, etc., etc., etc. And what did pension funds do? What did a couple of pension funds where I worked do? We just copied them and didn't figure out, wait a minute, what is needed to make it a success? We didn't copy quite that part with all the problems. And basically, yeah, detracting your long-term returns. The second one sort of relates to the discussion we had on the evidence-based element. You shouldn't base your beliefs on results. Sounds like an open door. Results might be a trigger to take a look, but never throw your beliefs away because results are disappointing. Let's try do the exercise the other way around. Suppose you have commodities in your portfolio, and as a board you really haven't thought this quite through. But no problem. For some reason, Saudi Arabia, political uncertainty, commodities double in price. What is the reaction going to be in the board? Probably a good choice. Also a good belief, by the way. We were very smart in thinking this through, so we should give ourselves an applause. In other words, you let the results lead the formulation of your beliefs, which is then pro-cyclical, and yeah, you can guess the rest when things go wrong. So here too, the other way, the evidence-based, if you will, approach is far more robust, successful, and also, I would say, help the slower-moving strategic loop, which is far more important for long-term success. I have three bullets. Let me take the simplification. A small warning against simplification. Simplification. We think that active management always pays off. We think that passive management should always be the basis. Both statements are wrong. We know, based on our CSCV studies, that there is no such thing as just passive or just active. It depends on the asset category, investment style, and even the regime, if you will. So the more simplified you state it, the more problems you create further down the whole investment process, and perhaps also make sure that some investment returns are not earned. Finally, that would be the part, if you have board members which strongly believe in that, That's also a tricky part, because there the question is, when you think about evidence-based, because this might well be a discussion where evidence sort of is ignored because there is a good reason towards a goal. I had this, for example, in a board meeting, well, actually a discussion about impact. I believe that impact investment pays off with the best returns, etc., etc., etc. Might well be, but the question was, well, why do you think that? No, I just believe this. So it's sort of shortcutted the whole way for an objective discussion on what do we know, where are uncertainties, and how strong should the belief be. So whenever someone believes, that's the tricky part. Okay, I'm finishing up. I'm sorry. So thank you very much for the. There's far more to say. It's just one chapter, but it's a very relevant one. It's at the heart of designing your investment process, but also guiding your investment process delegation. And I think if you the choice to choose this one is the right one, because I think if you want to take a step within, basically achieving, getting closer to investment excellence, this is the one to take. It's an important tool. I hope that was a message from my part. Beliefs offer you a clear structure. So beliefs, a theory, a strategy, and what is needed in the organization. That's one. Think about them. Do not change them when the results disappoint, but think about when new evidence comes to light. And also, I would say, with great beliefs comes great responsibilities. You should be aware that they could be used in less productive ways. And this is the point where I hand over to Jaap, who will tell you about the real practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Alfred. I have to be very practical. I understand from you, and I'm in the camp. I think, Christian, you loosely refer to that. I think often nothing is as practical as a good theory, and I think beliefs help you in that sense. Where I lost you for a second, Alfred, is when you said this: if you believe beliefs, then you're in real trouble. Is that what you said?
Yes. Okay, if you strongly believe in beliefs.
Okay, I have to think about that.
Yeah.
What I want to do in the next 20-ish minutes is present you a bit of the case of PFZW, Pensioenfonds voor Zorg en Welzijn, the second largest pension fund in the Netherlands. Theory to practice, and some examples how we did that. PFZW is the compulsory pension fund, industry pension fund for the healthcare sector in the Netherlands. Our assets under management right now are about 250 billion euros. And we have something like 2.4 million beneficiaries, of which 80% are women. So, to set the scene a bit, zoom back to 2011. I think the majority of you was probably already working in finance or something related to that then. In 2011, a couple of very significant things were coming together for pension fund Zorg en Welzijn. I will refer to that as PFZW if you allow me. First, PGG, we used to be called PGGM, and that was the integrated pension fund and also the pension delivery organization, doing the administration of the pensions and solving the whole investment puzzle. So one organization. But in 2008, as a consequence of changes in the Dutch legal environment, we split into two parts. One, PFZW, the pension fund, formerly responsible for making sure that the pension was paid, etc., etc., and PGGM, the pension delivery organization, which was there for doing the administration and doing all the investment management work. And we agreed between the two that PGGM would use PFZW as its sole fiduciary and investment manager. So there was a very strong relationship between the two. And we have a partnership and we're bound together with service level agreements. So there's a very strong sense of that we belong together, but still two different entities. Of course, also in 2011, we had the very intense situation of the great financial crisis just behind us. So the clouds had lifted. We were still around. That felt good. Well, not very bad. But we had some challenges there. we went into the crisis thinking that we were really, really smart textbook investors. We did the right things and right also, but that didn't keep us from losing 50 points of our solvency or 20-something% of our assets. So this was a great strategy, really doing textbook stuff, and turned out like that. And next to that, before the great financial crisis, I was really popular at parties where beneficiaries were around. They would push me in corners and say, hey, Jaap, I think you're a really interesting guy. All this was totally disappeared after the crisis. Worse than that, trust in financial institutions was at a low point, and strangely enough, but I think I understand, the trust of society and our beneficiaries in pension funds was extremely low. And by the way, that hasn't really improved over the past decade, which is a bad thing. So out of this situation emerged the need for a set of collectively owned beliefs or principles that could give strategic guidance. We needed strategic redirection. How will we cope with the investments going forward? We had many new people on the board, and they had new roles because we had these two entities which had to get used to each other. There was a lack of clarity on shared principles guiding investment decision making. So people around the table would look through different lenses at proposals being done. And we used to feel as the asset owner, but then we became the asset manager. So we needed guidance from PFZW to do our role right. And that also, well, that was not always a painless process, I can tell you. So we thought, let's make a set of investment beliefs. But how do you actually do that in a situation like this? And we did it a bit like this. We very strongly thought the board needs to own the investment beliefs. And that means that we can't, from the investment management organization, who perhaps had more knowledge, say, hey board, we thought about investment principles, here they are, please sign them. No, they had to find out for themselves. So there were six very strongly committed key board members who said, we will run this process personally. They also said, let's get a lot of external views, because if you ask the people inside the companies, you will get the answers that you already had. So let's go outside. In the process, our board members interviewed something like 30 external experts. Alfred was one of those, people like Keith Ambachs here, people from academia, people from peers, people from the investment management community, etc., etc. So that gave them a fresh look to the problem. And the board took the lead. They had a serious amount of board time committed. All in all, the process took a bit more than a year. So I'm not quite sure I want to recommend you to take a year for this, but serious time allotted. And we made sure that the outcome was collectively embraced by the whole board. So board members who were involved in formulating things and having experience, for example, on the basis of these interviews, would present their findings to the whole board. There would be discussions, and then in the end we would agree. So there was this collective embracement. That about the process. In this process, there were three key areas of interest to the board. The first one was, of course, financially, how are we going to fulfill the ambition to pay a good pension at a reasonable price going forward? What have we learned from this great financial crisis? How should we do things differently? But there were two other dimensions. First, we already were, I would say, a responsible investor. We felt that we need to earn our place in society by being a member of society that really contributes to society, for example, through sustainable investing, through having impact, if possible. So the question was, can we make a next great step in integrating this thinking into the financial thinking? And the third one was that the board wanted to be in control of this outsourced investment management process. partially because that makes sense, but also because the regulator very strongly after the great financial crisis said, hey, dear board, you are not only responsible for policies you formulate, you're also responsible for outcomes. So how do you make that? And the process was done in 3 parts for each of the 3 questions. So this whole process led to what we call the investment framework. I'm not quite sure whether the beliefs or the principles we formulated are as concrete as Alfred would like them to be, but let's talk about that. This investment framework is a set of 16 investment principles, and they are explained in a high-level 12-page document, which, by the way, you can find on the internet. And it is a bit philosophical every now and then, but let's see whether that works. So what does the framework look like? There are 3 parts: how to achieve the financial goals, how to look at responsibility, and how to be in control from the board perspective. From the financial perspective, one principle formulated is there are only a limited number of fundamentally different sources of return which reward the assumption of the associated risk over a long horizon, which is a bit loftily formulated perhaps, but it tells you you don't need 36 asset classes to have a good investment strategy. So you can reduce the complexity, and that helps a lot. I think it has helped a lot also. An example of a responsibility belief or principle is we assume our social responsibility by contributing tangibly to a sustainable, viable world. So we say there is a role for us to help the world become a more sustainable place. The how question is much later in the process. And third, in the governance and control dimension, complexity is only used if it's appropriate for the achievement of PFZW's pension ambition. Okay, so let's not be amateurs, let's not be over-engineering, let's only do what really contributes to the outcomes of PFZW's pension solution. And that also helped to reduce the complexity of the whole thing. The framework, I think, was quite successful, and it laid the basis for the elements that Alfred talked about. A better investment process, efficient implementation, and better decision making. But on top of that, I think it has given the fund a strategic direction, the direction of travel, both in the financial and in the societal sense. And that proved to be a strong starting point. One of the examples of how we apply the framework is that now every investment decision, be it on an asset class level or on a low level, will be looked at through the same 5 criteria: the contribution to the financial goals, contribution to the sustainable or responsible investing lens. What does it cost? Is it controllable from a board point of view? How complex is it? And is it explainable? Is it part of something that we can talk about? Not in all details, but does it make sense to have it in your portfolio? And the fact that both board members expect all this reasoning and the people in the investment management organization know that they have to deliver this reasoning gives efficiency to the process. The framework was adopted in 2014, so we now have 5 years of experience using it. And I'll give you some of the outcomes. I would say, on the whole, we have profited a lot from the board. Thank you. From the framework. First, I think the board has increased comfort on the oversight of the investments. It really helps them to focus on the forest and not dwell too much on the trees. Very important, I would say. Then the decision making on the basis of standardized documents, know what you have to deliver, know what you're getting. I think that really saves a lot of very valuable and scarce board time. The complexity of the portfolio was reduced because our belief said, well, if there's complexity that you're not sure that will pay off, why bother? So hedge funds were exited. The investment cost has been significantly lowered. I think efficient implementation really was a strong focus. And a lot of discipline in how we think we can generate returns. For example, our conviction on being active, on conviction on being able to be successful in tactical allocation, very low. So why bother? And that saves you a lot of energy. That means that you can focus on the things that really matter. And then I think it provided this basis for next steps in responsible investing. For example, in the strategic plan that we put on top of this framework, we said, let's halve our carbon footprint in the public markets over the next 5 years, and let's quadruple our impact investments in the next 5 years. We haven't quite delivered on those. Both we're close to, but the fact that you make strong statements on the basis of such principles means that you create movement in the right direction, and I'm quite proud of that. And I would recommend you to do the same if you want to move. Last 3 minutes, Christian. Okay, we'll speed up a bit. Ownership, maintenance, and review of investment beliefs. A bit more generic than the actual PFW case. 1, the beliefs have to be alive and kicking. This is not always easy, I would say. Sometimes the board will dwell on very difficult problems and forget about the beliefs. So ideally, I would say the beliefs should always be on the desk when they talk. In practice, well, sometimes a year they are a bit out of scope. I think, therefore, the ownership of the beliefs is very important. I think it's in the hand of the board, and we just discussed about this, Alfred, and we said, well, we think they should be owned by the chair of the investment committee. And he's the one to scrutinize whether they are really stick to or not. Board members come and go. That means that there's a large risk of drifting away from your beliefs when a new member comes aboard. I wouldn't necessarily go for static beliefs, but please be sure that your new board members very well know these beliefs, not necessarily subscribe 100% to them, but if they want to be radically different, they should be disciplined, is my strong opinion. So they need education, I would say. And then there's the review and maintenance process. In the end, I think Alfred was very clear on that beliefs are a set of working assumptions, strong assumptions, but assumptions, testable hypotheses. So you should test them, and they should be improved over time. And I would say don't do that every year, because then you're too close to the actual outcomes. But if you, for example, have a 3 or 5 year rolling process in which you look at these beliefs, you're doing good things. Practical advice. When to consider new investment beliefs? Well, if there is really leakage, if you're not performing according to plan and on all fronts you are losing money, then good moment to review your beliefs. If you don't feel in control from the board perspective, if you feel you waste a lot of board time on focusing on the trees instead of the forest, and last, I would say, but not least, when you seriously want to move up the excellence ladder. What that is can you find in our book. And many of you are probably from the investment management community. I think if you're from there, you have a very strong interest in having a great board, which has great beliefs, because it will provide to be a more reliable partner to do business with. So don't hesitate to stimulate the funds you work with to develop a set of beliefs. Key takeaways. An invaluable tool. I don't have to emphasize that anymore. Good beliefs are owned by the board and shared and used daily. Trustees to take ownership of the investment process. When to change your beliefs, I think I referred to that. And do not try this at home is meant to say, don't try to build a set of beliefs on Monday afternoon and drink a beer and say, hey, it's done. It's serious work, and you shouldn't be amateurish about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred and Jaap. Could I ask the gentleman to please take the little tables in front in the middle? That would be fantastic. And now you guys join that.
Yeah, sure.
Table there. And I'll briefly, before I pass the microphone to Oliver, a brief word about Oliver Grimm. Oliver is working for the pension fund of the city of Zurich. He's a CFA charter holder, and he's also in the committee of the Swiss Pensions Conference, and readily volunteered to host this Q&A session. Oliver?
So thank you very much, Chris. Welcome you also from my side. A very interesting topic that we discussed today. So I was asked to open the Q&A session. I was also asked to briefly give a feedback how we as a Swiss pension fund have focused on investment beliefs. And also I was asked to challenge that view. And that's very difficult actually, because we have adopted already a lot of your ideas, your setups that you mentioned. So how do we use investment beliefs? So we each 4 to 5 years run an ALM analysis, and before we start with the ALM, there's a discussion on investment beliefs. So we first come together with the investment team and also with the consultants. We define hypotheses, we define our main views, challenge them, discuss them. That's the first round. Then we go to the investment committee, not the board of trustees, the investment committee, and we discuss the views. We look whether they convince, whether they share these views, or whether they bring in new elements. Then we take a second round, go back again, internal meetings, discuss it to the research group where the advisors or consultants are again participating. And finally, it comes to the board of trustees, which have to sign up the document. Now, it's very important for us what you mentioned. So we need to own the beliefs, and we need to use them as a, I would say, it's difficult, but rather as a risk management tool, also to avoid wrong decisions and to have a guidance, forward guidance. That is very important, but it's not so easy as you can imagine. And there come some questions, and maybe also why we go first to the investment committee and not to the board of trustees has just one reason. The board of trustees delegated implementing the investment strategy to the IC, and all IC members are also participating in the board of trustees. So these are the key members, I would say, who are finally responsible for doing the investment decisions, and therefore this round, so to justify that from a governance point of view. Now, as being a representative of a public pension fund, there are also some challenges, of course, when formulating beliefs. And my question is, how do you deal with the fact that there might be inflicted or imposed beliefs, restrictions, which a part of the members bring in, which are sometimes personal views, which sometimes have political background, and how can you try to finally avoid to adopting these restrictions, even which may be contradictory to the main beliefs or the beliefs that you evaluated before? That is, I think, one question.
If you say politically or personal beliefs, then you might, for example, refer to, we have every now and then big discussions about how much we should invest in the Netherlands, being our home country, or, for example, how we should cope with climate change. Is that the kind of thing you're referring to?
Named two topics. The home bias is always a discussion, definitely focusing on local startup investment ideas and on ESG. That are the topics which
I'll talk about my experience, brain half, and you through the...
I also have some experience parts.
So I think it's important that your beliefs, that you collectively own your beliefs. So if different people in the board have different sets of belief, you will end up in trouble. So it needs some haggling probably. And for example, in the Netherlands, at PFZW, we say we recognize the fact that probably by investing more capital in our home country, we will do something potentially tangibly positive for the Dutch economy, but we will never compromise on our financial ambition. So this is a very sharp necessary condition, which never will lead to forced investment somewhere where it will be unproductive. And this can lead to tough discussions every now and then. When it comes to climate change, I like to think so. There are probably two very important things there. The first one is climate change is an outside-in risk and perhaps opportunity when it comes to managing your portfolio. I just glimpsed at one of your newspapers today, and the glaciers are melting, and therefore your ski resorts will probably become stranded assets, and therefore you run a serious risk in your portfolio when you invest in them. You better take care of that risk, no doubt about it. We all know that the energy transition will be there sooner or later. So if you see investment opportunity, go for it. And I think there you can find something like a lowest common denominator to start from. Then my advice would be find that lowest common denominator, be common, move, gain experience, and then in the next round make them bigger or more aspirational, but you should agree on them.
Perhaps to add to this, this is a bit more, I would say, which is a fiduciary responsibility answer. I know one situation where actually a question like this came across, but the problem is if it is a belief which is not collectively owned by the board, as a board from your prudent person or fiduciary responsibility, you have to make sure, wait a minute, if this would be the set which we think is optimally in terms of implementation of the goals, etc. Adding this belief or restriction would, well, let's just do the math and the calculation, it would mean this differential. So make it as transparent as possible, because otherwise you saddle, I think, the board with, a dilemma, because on the one hand they should pursue a different policy based on their fiduciary responsibilities than they otherwise should have done. So make it transparent. I think that's the key recommendation here.
Excellent. Another question that I have on you is, you said that, and I totally share that view, that investment beliefs need to be owned, but they also need to be biting. And now there are several people sitting around, so you start a discussion, you have a hypothesis, but everyone has a different interpretation and wants finally also to have a compromise. So when we define the investment beliefs, we write down the belief, and we write also down the consequence of that belief, which comes back then to defining the investment strategy, the allocation of the asset classes, etc. Now, if you have too loose assumptions or too much compromise, and it's not biting, then it's, according to my opinion, an alibi belief and not a belief.
Yeah.
Do you share this, and do you see that problem, and how do you overcome that?
Absolutely. I do operate in different kind of boards, and some are more political, if you will, than others. But I think that the key element, the discussion we're having here, is how to help boards, achieve better long-term returns. And there's just a suggestion which I find to be workable. Yes, there are 4 steps all the way from belief to organization, but focus first of all on the first 2. So I have a shared opinion on the board. Is this a belief? Is this the argumentation? When this sort of reaches a consensus, then you basically say, well, okay, wait a minute, let's reconvene in a couple of weeks. Let's do the investment staff do their work, because these are shared beliefs from the first 2 steps, so theory and argumentation, and let's see what they come with back in terms of, and what does this mean. And if you do it in the 2-step approach, because you have a consensus on the first step, it's quite difficult to be have a different opinions on the third and the fourth. So that's it's a bit of a behavioral. You sort of set a trap, if you will, but in a good and positive sense. Yeah.
Thank you. Another question, and here it's a Swiss. I think character. So we are not, when something works very well, making this. But we are more when something goes wrong. Oh, what was our belief? Are we sure? Is it surely the right belief, or did we something wrong? And this is also something you mentioned on the book. You often challenge your beliefs, your views in the worst time. So when your investment belief and the consequence in the strategy says, for example, do a rebalancing, then you have gut feelings. It's a terrible time. The world has changed completely. I won't do that now. How to overcome this? And we internally have tried to figure out a solution. Then we always come back to the beliefs and say, what was our definition, our precondition at that point in time, and then try to again be very sober and try to question. But nevertheless, gut feelings and going back is a difficult step. We try, not always successful, I would say.
So I think you're totally right. I think the beliefs essentially are meant to be a disciplining tool and to get you from this emotional reaction, thinking fast, into the thinking slow, into the rational brain. So if you breathe deep and say, hey, our assumption still valid, and is our belief still valid? So what's the conclusion? Then you're moving into slow thinking, and I think you can really be a much more successful investor. That being said, for example, like controlling your weight, sometimes you will not. But if that's 1 in 10 cases instead of 5 in 10 cases, you're doing a great job. So you also should be a bit forgiving to yourself, I would say. But stick to the beliefs, because they pay off in times that your emotional brain wants the worst things.
Okay, I'm doing 2 things now. First of all, holding in my stomach, so it's talking about me. I agree for 80%.
Okay.
No, of course 99. I tell, in some cases, I tell my boards or investment committees there are 365 days per year, and you practice 364 days per year for that one day, which really makes a difference. And you know beforehand what the difficult decisions are going to be. So let's stick with the rebalance. Is one of those very, very, very difficult decisions. So I spend personally a lot of time, and it's not educating, but reinforcing the message. Why did we choose this policy based on these beliefs, and do we know the consequences? No, tomorrow will not be a bad day, but 2 days after this will be a bad day, and then we will probably rebalance. So reinforcing the message, also through policy documents, also always reiterating the investment beliefs, I think is very important in this. Yeah. That does occasionally give you a situation where really new information comes along, where we have to reassess. But even then my hypothesis will be we execute the policy and figure out how to adapt it later, and not the other way around. Okay, that's a bit mechanistic, but from a long-term investor perspective, I think it's far better to be consistently wrong than inconsistently right. That's also, I think, one of the big advantages of having those beliefs. Okay, that's my personal belief.
That sounds very theoretical, I have to say. I prepared the last question, but I think you already answered that. Therefore, I will just repeat it, and you can confirm. So, when to actually challenge or review your beliefs? On the one hand, of course, if new information comes in and you falsify your theory behind, that's clear. Then how we do it, we don't do it or try to avoid the worst times and change it, because then I'm very uncertain whether this will be a sensible approach. We do it, as said at the beginning, regularly. So each 4 years, again, putting all beliefs on the table, discussing, do we still share that view? And then, again, doing the round I mentioned at the beginning. And that's the kickoff for the ALM. I think this regular process avoids mistakes. Maybe sometimes we are too slow to update beliefs, but you have to stick to some rule.
It's a very sensible approach, because you make sure the review is sort of independent from the performance of some kind of disappointing performance. That's basically the worst time, because emotions get in the way and all kinds of things, to have this kind of discussion. And we're in the business of investing, and investing is a long-term horizon where we know there are also in hit ratio. So we then tend to we're lucky if we're 6 out of 10 times have positive returns and 4 out of 10 bad returns. So we also need to have the discipline to be slow. And I think the time to review them before the ALM study is a great point in time.
Excellent, thank you. Now I don't want to steal too much time from you, so do you have any additional questions from the audience?
You mentioned before boards which are a bit less experienced and who may not have access to 30 external advisors.
Yeah.
I also understand that you try to remain as neutral as possible when you advise them to avoid personal bias. So how do you help them formulating their beliefs?
I would say I hope that not the whole board is very inexperienced. That might need some attention then. But for example, I very much like the idea that you have this starter set of beliefs. I think those are very simple, parsimonious, efficient beliefs. And then you might say, if we adopt these, and they are all, I think, based in sound academic proof, sound academic thinking. So then you might say, what if we added something to this set? If we would add complexity, what would it help you in terms of realizing your purpose both in the financial perhaps and in the broader sense? And then you could probably have a very focused discussion on adding beliefs. You still need experts for that. Oh, okay. I was probably okay. I was ready. So.
I think you spoke loud enough. Any other questions? Okay.
A theoretical question for you. So these core beliefs, do you have an experience of how much core belief you should work with? Because I heard that you have a document of 16 pages, and then that as a day-to-day working document sounds to me quite long. So what are we talking about?
This is okay. From a very practical point of view, and it's I would say I would link this with the governance discussion, which we haven't dealt with today. But if you talk about governance budget, if you will, in my experience, a fund which defines 5 essential beliefs could work very fine, but it wouldn't work for a fund with the size, for example, of PFCW. And there you see it moving up somewhere between 10 and 15. My personal advice would be never to do more than 10, for the very simple reason that if you add more, you get conflicting messages. And that's all very fine for a very Zen-like board, which can weigh those different dilemmas. But you're also in the business of giving your investment managers and your investment organization guidance on how to proceed. So whenever I see more than 10, I'm sort of getting second thoughts about the effectiveness of implementation. Let's rephrase it that way.
Yeah, with the benefit of hindsight, I would say let's not go into discussing about the number of pages, but probably the way that we formulated our principles was still a bit open for interpretation. So were they biting enough? That's a bit of the question. And could you really use them for your day-to-day decision making? Well, that needs a bit of interpretation. So a shorter, sharper document might be more effective.
So we have time for the last question.
Well, my question is on international cultural dimension, on on pension beliefs. I think you made an inventarization of other countries. What you presented here, is that a typical Dutch approach, or is that a universal set of beliefs?
Very good question. The answer is universal. Somewhere lying behind there's a database, or that's the grand word for a lot of Excel sheets, where we made an inventory of those beliefs, and these would, I would say, form the commonalities. And per country, you see different choices, absolutely. And in some countries, you find example due to culture that I would say, a more entrepreneurial approach towards asset allocation. Let's say dynamic asset allocation tends to stick more to the forefront. Well, where in Scandinavian countries you find more investment beliefs tackling, for example, sustainability. Yes, there are definitely different flavors per country to be identified. But these tend to be, I would say, the United Nations Charter, if you will, for investment beliefs.
And so my statement is, of course, not statistically significant. I'm only one representative of Switzerland, but I have heard a lot, of course, of these topics, and we also have incorporated several of these views. So, yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for the great questions.
Yeah. Okay.